she was so conscious of the falsity of the accusation that she rebuked herself for being moved by it, and raising her head, gave a proud look round, as if in appeal to her companions. "Where's the skirt of Lady Farnham's dress? The flounce is not put on? I am surprised." "May I ask to whom this work was entrusted yesterday?" inquired Mrs Mason, fixing her eyes on Ruth. "I was to have done it, but I made a mistake, and had to undo it. I am very sorry." "I might have guessed, certainly. There is little difficulty, to be sure, in discovering when work has been neglected or spoilt, into whose hands it has fallen." Such were the speeches which fell to Ruth's share on this day of all days, when she was least fitted to bear them with equanimity. In the afternoon it was necessary for Mrs Mason to go a few miles into the country. She left injunctions, and orders, and directions, and prohibitions without end; but at last she was gone, and in the relief of her absence, Ruth laid her arms on the table, and burying her head, began to cry aloud, with weak, unchecked sobs. "Don't cry, Miss Hilton. Ruthie, never mind the old dragon. How will you bear on for 5 years, if you don't spirit yourself up not to care a straw for what she says?" were some of the modes of comfort and sympathy administered by the young workwomen. Jenny, with a wiser insight into the grievance and its remedy, said: "Suppose Ruth goes out instead of you, Fanny Barton, to do the errands. The fresh air will do her good; and you know you dislike the cold east winds, while Ruth says she enjoys frost and snow, and all kinds of shivery weather." Fanny Barton was a great sleepy looking girl, huddling over the fire; no one so willing as she to relinquish the walk on this bleak afternoon, when the east wind blew keenly down the street, drying up the very snow itself. There was no temptation to come abroad, for those who were not absolutely obliged to leave their warm rooms. Indeed, the dusked hour showed that it was the usual tea time for the humble inhabitants of that part of the town through which Ruth had to pass on her shopping expedition. As she came to the high ground just above the river, where the street sloped rapidly down to the bridge, she saw the flat country beyond all, covered with snow, making the black dome of the cloud-laden sky appear yet blacker, as if the winter's night had never fairly gone away, but had hovered on the edge of the world all through the short bleak day. Down by the bridge, where there was a little shelving bank, used as a landing place for any pleasure boats that could float on that shallow stream, some children were playing, and, defying the cold, one of them had got a large washing tub, and with the use of a broken oar kept steering and pushing himself hither and thither in the little creek, much to the admiration of his companions, who stood gravely looking on, immovable in their attentive observation of the hero, although their faces were blue with cold, and their hands crammed deep into their pockets with some faint hope of finding warmth there. Perhaps they feared that, if they unpacked themselves from their lumpy attitudes and began to move about, the cruel wind would find its way into every cranny of their tattered dress. They were all huddled up, and still, with eyes intent on the embryo sailor. At last, one little man, envious of the reputation that his playfellow was acquiring by his daring, called out: "I'll set thee a craddy, Tom. Thou daren't go over yon black line in the water, out into the real river." Of course, the challenge was not to be refused, and Tom paddled away towards the dark line, beyond which the river swept with smooth, steady current. Ruth, a child in years herself, stood at the top of the declivity, watching the adventurer, but as unconscious of any danger as the group of children below. At their playfellow's success, they broke through the calm gravity of observation into boisterous marks of applause, clapping their hands and stamping their impatient little feet, and shouting, "Well done, Tom! Thou hast done it rarely!" Tom stood in childish dignity for a moment, facing his admirers. Then, in an instant, his washing-tub boat was whirled around, and he lost his balance and fell out, and both he and his boat were carried away slowly but surely by the strong full river which eternally moved onwards to the sea. The children shrieked aloud with terror, and Ruth flew down to the little bay, and far into its shallow waters, before she felt how useless such an action was, and that the sensible plan would have been to seek for efficient help. Hardly had this thought struck her, when louder and sharper than the sullen roar of the stream that was ceaselessly and unrelentingly flowing on, came the splash of a horse galloping through the water in which she was standing. Past her like lightning, down in the stream, swimming along with the current, a stooping rider, an outstretched grasping arm, a little life redeemed, and a child saved to those who loved it. Ruth stood dizzy and sick with emotion while all this took place, and when the rider turned the swimming horse and slowly breasted up the river to the landing place, she recognised him as the Mr Bellingham of the night before. He carried the unconscious child across his horse. The body hung in so lifeless a manner that Ruth believed it was dead, and her eyes were suddenly blinded with tears. She waded back to the beach, to the point toward which Mr Bellingham was directing his horse. "Is he dead?" asked she, stretching out her arms to receive the little fellow, for she instinctively felt that the position in which he hung was not the most conducive to returning consciousness, if indeed it would ever return. "I think not," answered Mr Bellingham, as he gave the child to her, before springing off his horse. "Is he your brother? Do you know who he is?" "Look!" said Ruth, who had sat down upon the ground, the better to prop the poor lad. "His hand twitches. He lives. Oh, sir, he lives. Whose boy is he?" to the people who came hurrying and gathering to the spot at the rumour of an accident. "He's old Nelly Brownson," said they, "her grandson." "We must take him into a house directly," said she. "Is his home far off?" "No, it's just close by." "One of you go for a doctor at once," said Mr Bellingham, authoritatively, "and bring him to the old woman's without delay. You must not hold him any longer," he continued, speaking to Ruth, and remembering her face now for the first time. "Your dress is dripping wet already. Here, you fellow, take him up, d'ye see?" But the child's hand had nervously clenched Ruth's dress, and she would not have him disturbed. She carried her heavy burden very tenderly toward a mean little cottage indicated by the neighbours. An old crippled woman was coming out of the door, shaking all over with agitation. "Dear heart," said she, "he's the last of 'em all, and he's gone afore me." "Nonsense!" said Mr Bellingham. "The boy is alive, and likely to live." But the old woman was helpless and hopeless, and insisted on believing that her grandson was dead; and dead he would have been if it had not been for Ruth, and one or two of the more sensible neighbours, who, under Mr Bellingham's directions, bustled about, and did all that was necessary until animation was restored. "What a confounded time those people are in fetching the doctor!" said Mr Bellingham to Ruth, between whom and himself a sort of silent understanding had sprung up from the circumstances of their having been the only two, besides mere children, who had witnessed the accident, and also the only two to whom a certain degree of cultivation had given the power of understanding each other's thoughts and even each other's words. It takes so much to knock an idea into such stupid people's heads. They stood gaping and asking which doctor they were to go for, as if it signified whether it was Brown or Smith, so long as he had his wits about him. I have no more time to waste here, either. I was on the gallop when I caught sight of the lad, and now he has fairly sobbed and opened his eyes. I see no use in my staying in this stifling atmosphere. May I trouble you with one thing? Will you be so good as to see that the little fellow has all that he wants?